Hello, my name is Nancy Sifford Alana. I am an author and the author of this book, The Lost Treasure of Lincoln County. This book takes place in 1958 in Lincoln County, North Carolina. The town that the main characters live in is Lincolnton. And the boys are the two main characters, Jonas and Dale. And they live across the street from one another. They're best friends, even though they're very different from each other. They are best friends, and during the summer they like to run and play and explore and just get outside and have a great time. Well, on one of their adventures, they were out along the creek bed. They find an old wooden box. They opened this small wooden box, and inside they found just a couple of things. First of all, there was an old velvet cloth, and they had no idea what that was about. They found a sheet of paper, an old sheet of paper that had some scribbles and marks on it. And then they found an old photograph, and it had a picture of a man and a woman and some children. On the back of the photograph, it says, Sifford, 1840. So with this information, they go to the library and they start trying to find out some more information. They ask Miss Bell where some books are that they can look through, and they found lots of books to search through. They did find one book that had that same picture, and they've checked it out. And when they were checking out, they asked if Miss Bell knew of anyone in the community who knew a lot about local history. And Miss Bell said, why, yes, she did, that there was a local historian by the name of Harry Sifford. Well, the boys' eyes just popped open because that was the same name that was on the back of that photo, but they didn't want to tell Miss Bell. So she told them where he lived. The boys found the house. The next morning, they went down and talked to Mr. Sifford. He seemed to think that there might be something to what they found, something that might be something they'd want to follow up on. So he cleaned up the box. He went through his papers. And now in Chapter 8, the boys are going back to Mr. Sifford's house, and they're going to see what Mr. Sifford has to say. Mr. Sifford and the boys finished their milk and cookies and took their dishes into the kitchen. Mrs. Sifford smiled at the boys and thanked them for using their manners. She was preparing something for lunch between loading the washing machine and hanging the clothes on the line. They wondered if she ever stopped working long enough to sit down and rest. All right, boys, let me tell you what I found last night while I was reading through this stack of papers, said Mr. Sifford. John Sifford was a German settler who moved to Lincoln County from Rowan County. He was a wagon maker, and that meant he was a good carpenter and could build just about anything. He could build a house or a barn or any other building he needed on his land. He was proud of his land, and he took good care of it. He treated it well so that it would provide plenty of crops to feed his family and his animals for a year at a time. Land was particularly important to a man and his family back then. Over the years, men have fought and lost their lives to keep their land because it was so valuable to them and their families, Mr. Sifford said. He reached for another set of papers and then continued. North Carolina became a part of the United States in 1789. John Sifford was 16 years old at that time. He was old enough to know about the American Revolution, and he knew how hard people had fought the British so that they could have their own free nation. Men and women were proud to be Americans back then, and they still are. Mr. Sifford continued, did you know that there was a battle over at Ramser's Mill during the American Revolution? Both boys shook their heads. They couldn't find their words to say no. There was, Mr. Sifford said with enthusiasm. It was a bloody battle. Lots of Lincoln County men fought to keep the British loyalists from taking our freedom. That's how much they loved their land and America. They were willing to fight for it and lose their lives if necessary. That battle was in 1780. I know that sounds like a long time ago, but it really wasn't that long ago. Think about it, boys. Most nations in Europe or Asia are thousands of years old. Ours is only 182 years. How does that help us solve our mystery? Asked Dale. He could tell Mr. Sifford knew a lot of the history of Lincoln County, but he could not take his mind off the treasure. You're right, Dale. I've been chasing rabbits, Mr. Sifford said, as he leaned back in his chair for a few seconds and sat up straight again and continued. John Sifford had 247 acres, and I bet you he walked every inch of it. He wanted to see the land for himself and find the best spots to plow and the best spots to leave his pasture. After working his land for many years, John knew his land like the back of his hand. John Sifford was the son of German parents. The Germans were known for spending their money wisely and saving as much as they could. They did not waste anything if they could help it. Sometimes old John Sifford would hide his money he saved. Now this part, continued Mr. Sifford, we have always believed to be just a legend or a tale, but not really sure if it was true or not. We have heard over the years that John would bury some of his money so that it would be hidden from Indians or thieves. He'd bury it fairly close to the house, but sometimes he hid the money in remote places. But the box we found didn't have any money in it, Jonas reminded Mr. Sifford. That's true, Jonas, but there was something else in that box that may be more important than the money John Sifford could have put in it. That map may lead us to more than just money. You see, John had a good sense of humor. He liked to play tricks on people and then stand back and laugh at them whenever the trick was done. Old John Sifford always joked that he had buried some gold, but nobody believed him. That map just might show us whether he was joking or not. Mr. Sifford got up from the table and went toward the box that was sitting at the end of the long table. He'd cleaned it up and put some lemon oil on it. It looked much better than when Jonas and Dale had given it to him. Mr. Sifford opened the box and set the lid down on the table. He took out the velvet cloth, the picture, and the piece of paper. He carried the contents of the box back to his chair and sat down. Now, each one of these things is a clue to our mystery. We've got to think really hard and try to figure out what each one means. Mr. Sifford stopped and looked at the boys. You boys ready to use your heads? Both boys nodded and smiled. All right, let's look at this piece of paper. Mr. Sifford opened it up very carefully and flattened it with his hands. He reached for his magnifying glass and began looking closely at the faint writing on it. This looks like a river or creek because it's a wiggly line. It is possible that is the creek that you boys were playing in the other day. Over here is something that looks like, well, I'm not sure. What do you boys think? Jonas and Dale leaned over the table on their elbows and stared at the drawing. They looked at each other, shrugged their shoulders, and looked back down at the paper. The circles could be rocks or trees. Squares could be houses or barns. That looks like a triangle, said Dale. He was pleased that he had noticed their arrangement. Right, said Mr. Sifford. Good job, Dale. Now, let's look at some of these other markings. Let's suppose these circles are rocks. We now have rocks in a triangular formation next to a creek. Let's think about what we know about the creek. What do you boys know? I don't know anything special about the creek except that it runs next to the park. I've never gone any further than that. My mama would be madder than an old wet hen if I did, said Jonas. Me neither. I'd be doing my chores and my little brother's chores for a month if she caught me, said Dale. Mr. Sifford asked the boys if he could meet their parents. He wanted to tell them about the box and its contents and get their permission to do some exploring of the creek beyond the park. Although secrecy was important, Mr. Sifford knew that it was time to tell their parents. The boys agreed. Mr. Sifford asked if he could stop by their house the next night after supper and meet with both parents at the same time. Jonas and Dale said they would work it out. The boys explained to their parents the best they could that Mr. Sifford wanted to talk with them. Though they were curious, they knew of Mr. Sifford. Years ago, when they were in high school, when they were in high school, he had been on the school board. At 6:30 p.m., Jonas's parents walked over to Dale's house. They had a big front yard with chairs under the trees that they sat in after dinner. Dale's parents enjoyed watching the sunset and the children playing with and catching fireflies. Dale's parents were sitting outside when Jonas's parents arrived. "Well now," said Jonas's dad, "what do you suppose this is all about?" "Beats me," Dale's dad said, "but that looks like Mr. Sifford pulling up right there." They all looked up and saw Mr. Sifford park in front of the house. He was driving a 1953 Chevrolet Bel Air. It was polished and shiny and looked like it was kept in the garage when he wasn't driving it. Mr. Sifford walked around the car and over to the parents, who stood up to greet him. He introduced himself and shook their hands all the way around. He sat down in an empty chair and placed the wooden box on the grass beside his chair. "I'm sure you're wondering why I'm here, and I'm going to get right to it if you don't mind. That sun will be going down soon, and I don't want to keep you out here with the mosquitoes. I met your boys the other day when they rang my doorbell. You have two fine boys here. They are curious and smart, and my wife told me to tell you that they are very well-mannered." Jonas and Dale grinned at each other and then looked over at their parents. These boys found a box, and they came to me to help them solve a mystery. They did their homework by going to the library first and trying to find some answers on their own. Miss Bell, the librarian, suggested they find some answers on their own. Miss Bell, the librarian, said that I am the wisest and most knowledgeable in the county on local history. Mr. Sifford smiled and kept on going. "They showed me this box they found." He reached down and picked it up. This picture of John Sifford and his wife and some of the children. John Sifford, you see, was one of my ancestors who lived in Lincoln County in the 1800s. In my research, I found out that John owned a small wooden box that he kept his valuables in. "This is where the mystery comes in," said Mr. Sifford. "This paper appears to be a map. Jonas and Dale and I would like your permission to spend some time this week trying to follow this map to see if the legend is true." "What legend?" asked Jonas's dad. "The legend of a treasure buried by John Sifford on his land sometime after 1840. "That's more than 100 years ago," said Dale's dad. "You think there's a treasure that's been hidden for over 100 years out there?" "Yes, sir, I do," said Mr. Sifford. "I would like to help the boys follow this map and see if we have any luck in finding the treasure. Now, don't get me wrong. It may not be there, and we may be wasting our time, but I would sure like to give it a try. What do you think?" The boys' parents looked at each other in amazement. They discussed it among themselves and decided that since it was summer, it might be a good project for the boys. They agreed the boys could go with Mr. Sifford to hunt for the lost treasure. Their adventure would begin the next day at 9 a.m. in the park. Chapter 9, Seeking Clues Along the Creek. Morning could not come soon enough for the three treasure hunters. They met at the city park promptly at 9 a.m. Mr. Sifford had a tool bag filled with all sorts of things for their adventure and a lunch in a large black metal lunchbox with 3 sandwiches that Mrs. Sifford had prepared for them. She also put in some homemade cookies, which really made the boys smile. Mr. Sifford took charge and gave the boys their instructions. "We are going to be looking along the creek bank on the west side. There is no need to walk along the water. As much as possible, we need to be up on the high part of the bank. Look for large rocks in the formation of a triangle. If you think you see something we need to look at closely, call out and we will join up to look together. You boys go first and I will follow along behind you. I will carry the tools and put the lunchbox in the tool bag. Okay, boys, let's go. And watch for snakes. Snakes? Dale asked. You think we'll see some snakes? Well, I hope not, but you just never know when one will show up around the creek. Just keep your eyes open, you'll be all right, Mr. Sifford said in a calming voice. Dale was still nervous, though. Okay, there's one more thing. If someone asks you what we're doing, just tell them we're on a nature walk looking for birds and plants and such. We don't want the word to get out that we're on a treasure hunt, said Mr. Sifford as he started walking down the path that led to the creek. We're off. The three treasure hunters began their search. The boys had played along the creek for years, but they looked at it this time in a whole new way. They hoped to spot something that they had never seen before, so they kept their eyes open wide. Up and down the sides of the bank they walked. Sometimes the tree and brush were so thick they had to step down close to the water just to keep walking. Dale was looking as hard for snakes as he was for any rock formation. Dale, watch out, Jonas yelled. Dale turned around with fear in his eyes. He screamed and jumped up on a higher level of the creek bed. What? What are you yelling about? Dale's heart was beating quickly. Did you see a snake? Jonas laughed, and Mr. Sifford couldn't help but laugh out loud too. Why are you so spooked? Jonas asked when he finally stopped laughing. That's not funny, Dale said, and he put his head down and kept on walking. Is it lunchtime yet? Jonas asked. Not yet, Mr. Sifford answered. Let's keep on walking until we find a good area to stop and eat. The treasure-seeking trio continued walking and searching for another hour or so. They found lots of broken bottles, rocks of various colors, shapes, and sizes, all sorts of bugs and critters, and an occasional lizard, which Dale tried to ignore. Mr. Sifford looked directly above his head and saw that by the position of the sun, it was close to noon and time for lunch. They scrambled up on the creek bed and found a large rock to sit on under a tree. The shade from the tree was a welcome relief because the day was beginning to heat up. Mr. Sifford pulled the lunchbox out of the tool bag and handed each boy a sandwich. Inside his lunchbox was a thermos bottle of cold water. He poured some water into the lid of the thermos. They all took turns getting a drink from the thermos lid that served also as a cup. It didn't take them long to eat their sandwiches. They had worked up a hunger from all that walking. Mr. Sifford handed out the cookies. Jonas and Dale laid back on the big rock to relax and enjoy the last bite of their cookies. Look at that nest, Jonas. Dale had spied a bird's nest right above their heads. A mother bird was sitting on the nest and eyeing the three visitors to her tree. Oh, yeah, I see it, Jonas said. Think you can climb that tree? I don't know. It looks kind of dangerous to me. Dale was thinking that the last time he had seen a lizard, it was running up a tree. I think I'll give it a try. Can you give me a boost? Jonas sat up and started toward the tree trunk. Dale followed Jonas and joined his fingers together to make a two-handed support for Jonas to put his foot on. Once Jonas had put his foot on the support, Dale would stand up and lift him toward the first branch of the tree. Jonas managed to get onto the first branch. He took a moment to look around the tree. The bird's nest was on the other side, but the mother bird was not too happy with the new monkey climbing her tree. She didn't fly away, but she kept a sharp eye on Jonas. Wow, I can see really far from up here, Jonas shouted. Tell me what you see, Mr. Sifford said. Jonas reported, well, the creek goes on over that way. There aren't many rocks or trees for a pretty good stretch. I see some cows walking toward the creek. I guess they are after a drink or going to cool off in the creek. You're a good scout, Jonas. Why don't you come on down and we'll get back to our adventure? Mr. Sifford was rested, refueled, and ready to get back to business. Jonas jumped down from the tree. When he hit the ground, he landed on his feet with his knees bent. He fell forward and braced himself with his hands. He saw something unusual. "Mr. Sifford, what is this?" Jonas asked. Mr. Sifford walked over to help Jonas stand up. He thought Jonas had injured himself when he jumped off the tree, but Jonas was using his hands to wipe some dirt off of a rock. When he jumped out of the tree, he had spotted something unusual on the rock. In order to see it better, he needed to get some dirt off of it. Dale rushed over to help too. Mr. Sifford went back to his tool bag and pulled out a couple of small hand shovels and a paintbrush. "You boys be careful now. Let's scrape the dirt off this rock and brush it away with his paintbrush." All three of them were on their hands and knees. The rock was actually much larger than they had originally thought. The size of the rock got larger and larger as each layer of dirt was removed. "All right, boys," Mr. Sifford said. "Let's suppose for a moment that this marked rock is one of the circles on our map. Are there other things around there that could be the other circles on our map?" "Well, there's the rock Jonas and I were sitting on. That could be 2 circles, but I don't see anything for a 3rd circle," said Dale. He ran over to the big rock and stood up on it and looked around, hoping to see something that could be the 3rd circle. Mr. Sifford stood up straight, put his hands on his hips, and looked around. It was obvious he was thinking hard. John Sifford lived in this area more than 100 years ago. It has changed some, but probably not much. This tree is at least 100 years old. These rocks are certainly more than 100 years old and too difficult to move. If this is the spot, that 3rd circle should be right here. Mr. Sifford walked away from the tree and the rock, turned around and looked back at the boys and said, "I've got it. Jonas, walk over there by the creek. Is there a large rock on the edge of that creek?" "Yes, sir, there is. Right behind these thick bushes is a big rock. Let me see if I can get to it." Jonas pulled aside the bushes and small trees and, despite a few scratches, made his way to the rock. The X marked on this map could be in the center of those 3 circles, Mr. Sifford said. "We will never know unless we get started digging." Chapter 10, and this will be our last chapter for this part. Discovery in the stable. Mr. Sifford gave each of the boys a small hand shovel and kept one for himself. He did not know for sure what they were digging for, so Mr. Sifford cautioned the boys to be careful and not dig too deeply at one time. That was hard for the boys because they were excited. He also told the boys that if they came across anything unusual to say so and not to continue until he checked it out. Mr. Sifford and the boys began digging. It didn't take long for a small hill of dirt to form where they pitched the dirt to the side. It was getting hot, as most days in North Carolina are during the month of June. Luckily, they still had some shade from the tree to work under, but that would not last much longer. After about an hour, they were ready for a break. Mr. Sifford opened the thermos of cold water, took a couple of sips, and passed it over to Jonas and Dale. They were thankful for the opportunity to rest and cool off. "Let's get back to work, boys," Mr. Sifford said. "We've got work to do." The boys sprang back into action, ready to dig some more. Jonas couldn't help but do some daydreaming while he was digging. He tried to picture John Sifford walking in that area and thinking about a good place to bury something valuable. Jonas wondered why he wanted to bury something of value. There must have really been a good reason, but what could it be? Dale started humming the tune to the song Tom Dooley. It was a popular song by the Kingston Trio he had heard on the radio at home. Then he started singing, "Hang down your head, Tom Dooley, hang down your head and cry. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley, poor boy, you're bound to die." Jonas joined in and the boys started digging in time with the music. These were the only words they could remember, and so they sang them over and over. Mr. Sifford smiled and even joined in with them after the 3rd time through. Dale pushed his shovel into the dirt and hit something hard. At first he thought it was a rock. This area had plenty of them, but When he looked at what he hit, he realized it wasn't a rock. "Hey guys," Dale said, "I've hit something besides a rock." Jonas and Mr. Sifford stopped digging and turned around to see what Dale was talking about. Mr. Sifford took his hand shovel and gently moved some more dirt out. All he could see was something reddish-brown that looked like metal. Maybe it was an old tin can. Mr. Sifford continued to dig, and the object continued to show. Mr. Sifford was right. It was a tin can. About that time, Dale noticed a cloud moving across the sun. It was a large gray cloud. It felt good to the dirty diggers who were getting hot again, and it actually cooled the air down. Mr. Sifford looked up. "Boys, that looks like a rain cloud. If it starts raining, we're going to have to move away from this tree. It would just be our luck that this old tree would get struck by lightning with us standing under it." Mr. Sifford stood up and looked across the field to see if there was a structure they could run to quickly if it started raining. Less than a quarter of a mile out in the field, he saw a solitary structure that looked like an old horse stable. "You boys see that stable over there? If it starts raining, we are going to run over there for shelter. Just leave the tools. They'll be all right." Mr. Sifford and the boys got back down on their knees and started digging again. The more they dug, the more metal they uncovered. Disappointed, they had to admit it had probably been somebody's trash pile. After several more minutes, Jonas felt the first drop of rain, then the second. They dropped their shovels and started walking quickly toward the horse stable. Then the sky opened up and rain poured down. All three treasure hunters took off running. The stable wasn't very sturdy. It had obviously been there for a long time. It was dirty, dark, and full of cobwebs. Dale was not at all happy to be in there. He stayed close to Jonas and kept his eyes wide open. "It's raining cats and dogs out there. I sure hope it ends soon," said Mr. Sifford as he wiped his wet face off on his wet shirt sleeve. "You and me both," Dale said quickly. "This is creepy." The wind began to blow, and the cracks between the boards made the wind whistle with each gust. Dale's eyes opened even wider. He moved closer to Jonas and grabbed his right arm above the elbow. "Dale, let go of me," said Jonas with frustration in his voice. He gave Dale a push with his elbow, which caused Dale to step back. When he stepped back, his foot caught on something that made him trip and fall to the ground. "Jonas, what did you do that for?" Dale asked while sitting on the dirty floor of the stable. And then Dale saw what he had tripped over. "Hey guys, look!" On the floor of the stable were circles made of wood. Dale had tripped over one of them, and the other two were in the corners of the stable. They looked like a tree trunk that had been cut to form circles. You would have been able to count the rings in the wood to tell the age of the tree if it hadn't been so dark in there. Each circle was about 8 inches tall and partially buried under the ground. There on the floor of the stable were 3 circles in the form of a triangle. "What on earth are those?" Mr. Sifford asked. "Why would there be wooden stumps on the floor of a horse stable? Strange. You don't suppose..." Dale's words trailed off into his thoughts. "You don't suppose these are the 3 circles we're looking for, do you?" "They certainly could be," said Mr. Sifford. "There are 3 circles in the form of a triangle. I left my shovel out under the tree. As soon as it stops raining so hard, I'll go after it and we can get started digging in here." The rain ended as quickly as it started. Mr. Sifford walked back to the tree, picked up the small shovels. Once he was back inside the stable, the sun was shining and Dale was noticeably relieved. Okay, boys, let's try this again. Mr. Sifford said with an energizing voice. He knew the boys had probably worked harder that day than they had ever worked, and they were getting tired. It was dry inside the stable, but that was the only good thing about it. Dale wished they would hurry up and find the treasure so he could get out of there. After a few minutes of digging, Mr. Sifford noticed something strange for a stable. There was a wooden door on the floor of the stable, and it was covered with dirt. They cleared off the dirt the best they could, and they noticed there were rusty hinges on the door. Mr. Sifford stood up so he could get a firm grip on the door and pulled up. Dust and dirt flew everywhere. When the dust settled, they could see a rather large hole that had been carefully dug out many years ago. Sitting inside the hole was, and that's the end of that chapter. On our next part, part 6, we will start with chapter 11, the treasure. Sounds like they may have found something, boys and girls. So I hope that you are finding this story interesting. And don't forget that at the back of the book, there are a section that's called Fact and Fiction. And this part of the book will go chapter by chapter, and it will tell you the things that are talked about in that story, whether it's fact or fiction. So if you're wondering as we read along, was that really true? Then go back here to the back and you can find out if it's fact or fiction. Thank you for joining me today, and we will pick up with the next chapter when we start part 6. Thank you and have a great day.